Her daughter farmed the same land 30 years later. The land survived 2 panics, 1 drought, and 1 war. What she knew didn't come from any extension office. It came from her mother at a wooden seed box before sunrise. In 1910, wheat was selling for 81 cents a bushel in Nebraska, down from $1.02 just 12 months before. Farmers who had planted everything they had to wheat in 1909, betting the price would hold, were selling at a loss. And the county extension agents from the University of Nebraska were arriving at farms across the state with a new message. Specialize. Maximize yield per acre. Buy certified commercial seed. Stop growing what your grandmother grew. There was one farm on that road that had not planted everything to wheat. Her name was Sigrid Olsen, 44 years old, widow, 160 acres in Antelope County, Nebraska. Her neighbors said she was doing it the old way. They were not wrong. She was doing it the old way because the old way was the only way she had ever seen keep a piece of ground through every kind of year the plains could offer. The county extension agent had come to her fence line in the spring. He had brought certified commercial seed, turkey red wheat, the new variety, better yield per acre, standardized, tested. His price, 40 cents a bushel of seed. Sigrid's seed was already in her barn. She had selected it herself from the strongest heads in her best-performing field section, the same selection her mother had taught her to make. It had cost her nothing. It had cost her mother 30 years of attention. The agricultural extension movement was not wrong about farming. It was built on real science. The University of Nebraska's College of Agriculture had been testing varieties, measuring yields, analyzing soil chemistry since the 1870s. By 1895, the year Sigrid first began teaching her daughter the seed box. The extension agents were reaching thousands of Nebraska farms with documented improvements, better varieties, soil testing, crop rotation calendars. The knowledge was real. The yield gains were real. The problem was not the knowledge. The problem was the one thing the knowledge didn't know it was replacing. But Sigrid had something the extension bulletin didn't. She had been watching her mother work this ground. Not for 1 season, for 20 years. Her mother had kept a journal, not of yields, of the ground itself. Which sections held water, which sections drained too fast, which seed heads in drought years were the ones to pull before the others. Her mother had said one thing, once, at the seed box, in the last spring before she died, and Sigrid had written it in the margin of the journal in pencil. The seed that survives your worst year is the seed worth planting in your best. That was it. That was the whole curriculum. The Nebraska plains had been telling farmers something since the first broken sod. The ground wanted to be complex. It wanted the rye that came before the wheat. It wanted the kitchen garden refuse folded back in at the end of summer. It wanted the sections left fallow in the 3rd year. The ground did not want to grow one thing at maximum extraction every single year. It could do it. For a while. But the ground remembered everything done to it, and eventually it produced what it had been given. Nothing more. The extension agent's name was Walter Price. He worked out of the University of Nebraska College of Agriculture. He was 26 years old, trained in agricultural science, and he believed, correctly by every measure he had, that what he was bringing to Antelope County was better than what he was replacing. He came to Sigrid's fence line in the spring of 1907 with her neighbor Magnus Bjork, who had already switched to certified commercial seed and recorded his best yield in 4 years. He said, "Mrs. Olsen, I'm not asking you to abandon what you've always done. I'm asking you to compare. Look at Bjork's yield this spring. Look at the test plot results from Lincoln. What you're growing, the mixed selection, the old varieties. It's not producing what this ground can produce. You're leaving 20% on the table every single harvest." He was right about the yield number. Magnus Bjork's certified seed was producing 20% more per acre in a normal year. The agent was not lying. He was not guessing. He had the numbers. Magnus Bjork said it at the farm supply store in Neli that fall, not unkindly. She's still growing her grandmother's wheat. The extension agent showed her the yield comparison. She nodded and thanked him and kept doing it the same way. "I don't understand it. The numbers are right there. She can see them. By the time her daughter takes over that ground, she'll have to start from nothing." By the following spring, the extension agent had sent a second letter to Sigrid's address. This one included the university's soil fertility recommendation. Abandon the crop rotation, add chemical fertilizer to compensate. Plant the full acreage to wheat. It was the most modern advice available in Nebraska in 1908. It was advice built for the best 10 years on record. Sigrid read the second letter on a Thursday evening in March. She read the yield comparison. She read the soil fertility schedule. She set them both down. Then she reached for the journal, not to argue with the bulletin. She was not arguing. She was checking. Every year of her mother's record, every year of her own, every drought section, every wet summer, every year the certified seed her neighbors bought produced its 20% more, and every year her old selection survived something the certified seed did not. She was not choosing between good and bad. She was choosing between what performed in the best years and what endured in every year. Her neighbor on the east side, a woman named Lena Haugen, who had switched to certified seed the previous year, came to Sigrid's fence line one morning in April. She had watched Sigrid refuse the extension agent twice. She noticed Astrid at the seed box before she noticed anything else. The girl's hands moving the way her mother's moved. She asked, "Aren't you worried? Bjork's yield is up again. The agent says if you don't get the soil fertility right, the ground will just stop." Sigrid looked at her fields. Then she said, "The ground hasn't stopped yet. It's been planted 60 years by my family. If I'd been extracting it the whole 60 years, it would have stopped by now." Lena was quiet. Then she said what she had actually come to ask. "What are you teaching the girl? She's going to farm this after you. She should know what the extension office knows." Sigrid looked at her daughter bent over the seed box. Astrid had a seed head between her fingers, testing the weight, the way her mother had shown her. Then Sigrid, "She will know what the extension office knows. She will also know what it doesn't know yet. The second thing is what keeps a farm in a bad year." Lena stood at the fence for a long time. Then she asked quietly, "What doesn't it know yet?" The extension bulletin measured one thing, yield per acre. It measured it correctly, and what it found was true. Certified commercial seed produced more wheat per acre in a good year. What the bulletin did not measure. What happened to that seed in the second dry summer? What happened to the soil that had been pushed for 3 consecutive maximum seasons? What happened to a farm that had one variety of wheat, bought from a commercial dealer with no backup, when that variety encountered a disease it had never seen before? The extension agent's model was built on what farming looked like at its best. Sigrid's model was built on what farming looked like across every kind of year. Those are not the same model. Sigrid had not invented what she was doing. She had inherited it. Her mother had learned it from her mother. Her mother's mother had brought it from Sweden. A different country, a different soil, but the same principle. The seed must know your worst year, because a seed that has only ever known your best year is not a seed. It is a promise the ground hasn't been asked to keep yet. Astrid had been hearing that principle since before she could name it. She had been carrying seed sacks since she was 8. She had been selecting since she was 10. She did not think of it as learning. She thought of it as spring. Every year, Sigrid selected from the plants that had performed in the hardest section of the season, not the overall best yield, the best yield from the worst period. That selection, year over year, produced a seed that was specifically adapted to this farm, to this soil, to this rainfall pattern, to this drainage, to this 30-year record of what Antelope County eventually always did to the wheat. The extension agent had a better seed for the average Nebraska farm. Sigrid had a better seed for this specific farm. In the winter of 1903, 8 years into teaching Astrid, 8 years into refusing the agent, Sigrid sat at the table and asked herself the question she had been carrying since the first refusal. Was she being careful, or was she being stubborn? Those are not the same thing, and out on the Nebraska plains, the difference between them was a farm. She checked her mother's record, not because it was wrong, because she needed it to be right. Her mother's record showed 3 drought events in the years before Sigrid was born. In each one, the commercial seed available at the time, bought fresh that year, had failed. The saved selection, the one adapted to the ground, had produced. Not abundantly, but enough. Always enough. Every year, before the first snow, she walked the fallow section and took a handful of soil. Not to test it, to remember what she was giving back to the ground that had been giving to her. Astrid walked the section with her. She didn't explain it. She just let the girls see what her hands did. Then they went in. This is what Walter Price's certified commercial seed could not carry. Place. The commercial seed was bred for average Nebraska. Sigrid's seed had been bred year by year, selection by selection, for this specific 160 acres in Antelope County, through drought years and wet years, and the year the grasshoppers came through the north section. Every envelope in that box was a decade of observation, made physical. Every year, Astrid sat at the box, taking the pencil from behind her ear, labeling the next year's selection. She was not repeating her mother's habit. She was continuing a 30-year conversation between this family and this piece of ground. And that conversation could not be purchased from any commercial dealer in the state of Nebraska. One evening that spring, Astrid watched Sigrid label a new envelope. She asked, "Why do you write that one down? You write some and not others." Sigrid held the envelope up. "This one came through the dry July. The others didn't lose anything. This one lost something and kept going." She paused. "That is the one I need to remember." Astrid looked at it. Then she reached for the pencil behind her mother's ear. "I'll write it." The wheat price hit 81 cents a bushel. This was not a disaster in the way a drought is a disaster. The wheat was there. The harvest was real. It was just worth 39% less than it had been worth 3 years before. And the farmers who had taken the extension agent's advice, who had abandoned the rotation, bought the certified seed, planted the full acreage to one maximum yield crop, they had more wheat than any other year, and they were selling it at a loss. Magnus Björk had his best yield ever in 1910. He had followed the extension advice completely. Maximum acreage, certified seed, chemical fertilizer, everything in. His yield was 23% higher than his 1907 harvest. His revenue was 19% lower, because the price hadn't held and the soil pushed for 3 years at maximum extraction without the rotation, was beginning to show what it had been given. Not yet failed, but thinner, lighter, more compacted, the dark tilth of good soil lightening toward pale. Sigrid Olsen's 1910 harvest was smaller than Magnus Björk's. She had never claimed it would be larger. She held a head of wheat from the field section that had performed best in the dry stretch of July. She had selected it herself. Her mother had taught her how to select it, and for one moment, kneeling in the smaller harvest, in the price collapse, with 3 years of the agent's voice still in her memory, she felt the question she had never let herself ask fully before. Not, is smaller and right still enough? Something deeper, something that went after the inheritance itself. What if my mother was right for 30 years and wrong for this one? What if the ground had changed and she hadn't? What if the journal had stopped being true before she noticed? She stayed in the field. Let that question be there without pushing it away, because if she couldn't sit with it, if she needed it to be wrong before she checked, then she was not being careful. She was being stubborn, and those were not the same thing. Then she stood up, walked back to the barn, opened the seed box. She took the pencil from behind her ear, and she opened the journal, not to the current year, to the drought years her mother had recorded before Sigrid was born. She read them, not because they were right, because she needed them to still be right, and they were. The seed that survived the hard July, the same pattern, the same selection principle, the same ground telling the same truth, was the seed worth keeping. Her mother had been right for 30 years because she had been watching for 30 years, not because the journal was permanent, because the watching never stopped. Her 81-cent wheat covered her costs. The rotation had reduced her acreage but preserved her soil. The fallow section had given her ground something back. She was not ahead, but she was there. The clock was not running against her. By November 1910, Magnus Björk had borrowed against the 1911 crop to cover the shortfall. He was farming for the bank now, the thing he had never planned to do. 2 other farms in the township did the same. One of them wouldn't recover from it. Sigrid Olsen's farm covered its costs from the partial revenue, the kitchen garden, the rye she had sold from the fallow section as cover crop seed to 3 neighboring farms. Same price collapse. Same county. Same wheat. Different what she grew besides wheat. The spring came. Sigrid's farm came with it, smaller than Björk's, stranger-looking, and carrying no borrowed note. Magnus Björk came to her fence line in March of 1911, not with the extension agent, alone. He stood at the edge of her fallow section, the one growing rye, the one that everyone had called wasted ground, and looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "How do you know which ground to rest and which ground to push?" "Every year." "How do you know?" Sigrid said, "My mother kept a journal, not of yields, of the ground, what it looked like after a drought, what it looked like after it had been given a year to rest, what the wheat did in the section that had rested versus the section that hadn't. 30 years of that record. And then I kept it. The ground tells you what it needs. You just have to be watching in the hard years, not only in the good ones." She paused. "The extension agent is watching in the good years. I am watching in all of them." Björk looked at the rye for a long while. Then he said, "Next year I want to see your mother's journal." He didn't apologize. Walter Price came to the fence line the following week. He stood looking at the patchwork. the rye on the fallow section, the 2 wheat selections, the kitchen garden border. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The bulletin doesn't have a page for that." He gestured at the whole of it. "We measure fields. We haven't figured out how to measure what's inside a journal like yours." He did not apologize either. He walked back to his wagon. And the next year, Walter Price began asking farmers not just what their yield was, but how long they had been watching the same ground. Sigrid walked back to the barn. She set a head of wheat from the 1910 harvest, the one from the hard July section, in the seed box with care. She labeled it. Then she called her daughter to come see what the seed from a bad year looked like, and what it meant. Walter Price was not wrong about farming. The certified seed he carried was better. The yield data was accurate. The soil chemistry he measured was real. He was bringing the best available agricultural science in the state of Nebraska to every farm in the county. What the science of 1907 did not yet carry was the knowledge that sits outside of science, not instead of it, not above it, but beside it. The knowledge of a specific place, over a long time, through every kind of year. By 1914, the Smith-Lever Act would formally establish the county extension system across America. The extension agents would help millions of farmers. The knowledge was real, and it was good, and none of it could be downloaded into a seed box in a barn in one generation. It had to be earned, year by year, selection by selection, in the hard years especially. And then it had to be given to a child who was 8 years old and carrying seed sacks before she understood why. The same road, the same land, the same sky that delivered the price collapse, and the drought after that, and the war after that. What changed was who was still reading the ground. By 1925, Astrid Olsen was farming her mother's land. She had her grandmother's seed journal, her mother's 30 years of additions, her own first 5 years of selection beginning at the back. She had the extension agent's bulletins too, all of them. She used them. She had been taught the difference between what works everywhere and what works here, and she knew, because her mother had made her learn it at a seed box before sunrise when she was 8 years old, which one saved the farm in the hard years. Astrid Olsen was not remarkable for what she knew. She was remarkable for what she had been given before she knew she needed it, and after that. The Olsen land was never farmed by anyone who didn't know what the seed from a bad year was worth keeping for. This story draws from documented history. The wheat price in Nebraska in 1910 was 81 cents per bushel, down from $1.02 in January of that year. This is documented in USDA records. The years 1910 to 1914 became the agricultural parity benchmark. The baseline American farm groups used to measure what farmers deserved. This is documented. The Smith-Lever Act of 1914 established the National Cooperative Extension Service, funded through land-grant universities, with county agents reaching farmers across Nebraska. This is real. The United States lost an estimated 95% of certain crop varieties over the 20th century as commercial seed replaced, saved open-pollinated varieties. This is documented. Sigrid Olsen, her daughter Astrid, Magnus Björk, Lena Haugen, and Walter Price are fictional characters placed inside this real historical record. The seed box is real. The journal is always real. Most knowledge gets written down and passed forward in books. Some knowledge gets passed forward in a seed box at dawn by a woman who learned it from a woman who learned it from the ground itself. History remembers the extension agents who modernized American farming, But the ground was kept alive. In the hard years, in the specific years, in the years the average failed, by the farmers who had been watching their particular piece of ground long enough to know what it needed when nobody else's answer would fit. If you are the kind of person who has ever learned something from watching a specific place long enough that the learning became invisible, you already know why you're here. Have you ever been handed knowledge that wasn't in any book? Knowledge that only existed because someone watched something carefully for a very long time? Tell me in the comments what it was. The future rarely arrives all at once. Usually, it starts with a girl who learned to carry seed sacks before she could explain why, and grew up to be the only one still farming the same ground 30 years later. This is American soil,